I've seen some confusion in my Discord server as to what's the difference between a struct and a class. And to that, my answer is in C++, there is no difference between a struct and a class. Now, I'm going to talk about other languages in a second, but when it comes to C++, the only difference that I see is in visibility. Let's say I have a struct called weapon S as in struct. I'm also going to create a class called weapon C as in class. Let's say that both of them has int damage 1 by default. Okay. By the way, I'm going to be using C++ 17. I'm going to create weapon S and weapon C. And I can say something like this. C out weapon S damage. Get the damage from the struct. F5. Okay, we get the damage of 1. Now here's the difference. If I say the same thing about weapon C, C damage, I get an error message. This is the difference in visibility or the accessibility. For a class, this syntax is omitted. If you don't say anything, by default, your variables are going to be private. For a struct, this syntax is omitted. Here, if you don't say anything, your variables are going to be public by default. So in order to get rid of the error message, I'm going to say public, and then I'm going to create a public function, int, I'll call it getDamage, return the private variable, damage. And here, instead of directly getting the variable, I'm going to say getDamage. Press F5. Okay, here's our result. And we can do exactly the same thing with a struct. Let's say I don't want other classes changing the variable damage. So this is private. You can only get the damage with a public variable, getDamage, and we return damage. And in our main, same thing, we use the function getDamage, F5. Okay. So in this case, whether it's a struct or a class, if I wanted to change the damage variable, S damage, if I wanted to do something like damage equals 5, I'm not going to be able to do it. And same thing with the class. Trying to access a private variable from the outside is going to give you an error message. So the only difference between a struct and a class in C++ is this. For a class, everything is private by default. I can omit this. It's going to be the same thing. For a struct, I can omit this syntax, public, because everything is public by default. And of course, the result is going to be the same. I can only access damage through something public, both for C and S. And the result is going to be the same. So the confusion is mostly coming from trying to find a difference when there really isn't. Now let me talk about some other languages. We haven't talked about C, but if you Google it, when we're talking about C, we have structs, but we don't have classes. C as a language doesn't also support things like inheritance, constructors, destructors, etc. Don't worry if you don't understand these things yet, I'm going to talk about them later. But in C, a struct is mostly just a memory block. It's just something that groups together a bunch of data types. It doesn't have things like inheritance, constructors, destructors. But in C++, these things are supported, and you can use them just by using some simple syntax. And you can use them whether you're using a struct or a class. It really makes no difference. These are also important parts of OOP. I'll talk about this later. You can still express these things in C. It's just that you have to come up with your own tricks and solutions to express them. These concepts are a lot easier to express in C++. And I see a lot of people treating structs in C++ like they would treat a struct in C. Oftentimes you're going to hear people say, only use structs when you're grouping a bunch of primitive data types. Anything more complex like inheritance or polymorphism, use a class. But mostly when you're building your game in C++, when you're building your indie game in C++, you don't really have to worry about this. And I also see a lot of people coming from Unity and C# saying, hey, if there's no difference between a struct and a class, can I just use classes? And the answer is yes. It's mostly up to you or whoever's leading your team. It comes down to preference and what is more manageable, and you can write manageable code either way. What you shouldn't do is confuse C# structs and classes, because here there is a clear difference between a struct and a class. In C#, the difference is values versus references. I'm not going to talk about C# in this video, but check out video number 13 and you'll get the idea of the difference between values versus references. So we have 3 different languages and they all use the same word struct, and C++ has backward compatibility to C, so I can see where the confusion is coming from. But again, most of the time when you're working on your indie game in C++, you don't even have to see the difference between a struct and a class. I'm making this video so that the next time you see someone using a struct, and it's nothing more than some sort of a way to group together a bunch of primitive data types, you don't get confused. But also don't get confused when you see someone using a struct, like how would you use a class. It just comes down to what is more accepted by more people. It comes down to your style. And that's about it. If you have any questions, you can reach me on my Discord server. I have all the links below. Thanks for watching. See you next time.